Senator Smith.
I'll start from the beginning. It's a pleasure to stand up today and speak on this particular piece of legislation. Unfortunately, with the time available to me, I'm not going to have the opportunity to say everything this afternoon, but I am going to say some remarks, and I'm specifically going to comment on the less than accurate, I would say mischievous, but I don't think I know Senator Moore and I know Senator Siewert, and I work closely with them, so I won't use the word mischievous, comments that have been in the papers today about the Human Rights Committee and its deliberations, and I'll come to that in a moment. But it's with pleasure that I rise to speak on the bill today, because this legislation is designed to do something long overdue in this country. All of us in this parliament are committed to assisting the most vulnerable in our community. We all share an interest in helping those who are unable to defend for themselves financially. And I happily believe that senators from other parties, which makes some of the attacks we hear from those opposites all the more galling, because I don't doubt for one moment that they share that same aspiration. No political party in this country has a monopoly on compassion, and the consistent attempts by some of those opposites to cast debates on these matters in Dickinson terms are as false as they are tiresome. But the simple fact is that if we want to make sure that the generations to come enjoy the same sort of social support networks and frameworks as current generations, we have a responsibility today to get government spending in our country onto a more sustainable footing. I know that this is a point that many opposite either can't or won't accept, but we cannot continue to spend the way we have been spending. Without wanting to traverse the same ground at length, we have to look at the situation this government inherited when it came to office just over a year ago. We face a situation where government debt, in the absence of any action to correct our current course, was on track to hit $667 billion in a decade's time. And I would have thought that was pretty clear. That was a very obvious signal of the unsustainable nature of our spending. Look at it another way. Between 2012 and 2018, the former Labor government was planning to increase government spending by about 16%. On an international basis, that puts Australia right at the top of the list in terms of government spending. While there are certain tables where it would be good to see Australia at the top, this is certainly not one of them. In more immediate terms, what Labor's runaway debt position means is an interest bill for the nation of around $1 billion every month. That's a huge opportunity cost for this generation and for future generations. Just imagine what a government could do with an extra $1 billion per month in terms of delivering critical infrastructure, providing support for health and education services, or indeed giving the people's money back to them. Because it's not government money ultimately, it belongs to those who pay the tax in the first instance. But bizarrely, the position of those opposite is that we should continue living it up today and let tomorrow look after itself. That is not the responsible way. That is not the new government's way. We were elected because we said we would get the budget back on track, and that is what we are determined to do, and that is what we will do. Future generations will not thank those of us in this parliament today if they find the cupboard is bare when they need the support down the track, and indeed in more perilous times. Let me be clear. I have supported the government measures. I have supported all of the government budget measures. I'm not just on the public record in Western Australia, I'm in the public record in many of our nation's papers supporting budget measures, all of them. These are difficult times, they require difficult answers. I wasn't surprised to learn that Labor today had sought to scaremonger, to misrepresent the report of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights. I was disappointed that ACOS, who I have met a couple of times, decided to join in that scaremongering. What ACOS says isn't wrong, it's just not completely true. What Labor has said isn't wrong, it's just not completely true. And I'm personally disappointed because Senator Moore and others will know that the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights in our parliament like other scrutiny committees, has a cherished and valuable role. It is free from the partisan politics that dominate other committees. Just for the information of senators and those that might have an interest, let me just explain what it is that we do. The main function of the committee is to examine bills and legislative instruments that come before the Parliament for compatibility with human rights, as defined by 7 core international human rights conventions to which Australia is a party. In simple terms, those conventions define a range of civil and political rights, as well as rights collectively described as economic, social and cultural rights. To understand the way in which the committee undertakes its examination of legislation, it is critical to note that aside from absolute rights, such as the right not to be subject to torture, human rights may be generally subject to what are termed permissible limitations under international human rights law. Accordingly, the committee's analytical framework focuses on first identifying if a proposed measure might have the effect of limiting the enjoyment of a specific right, and second, whether any such limitations may be regarded as permissible or justified. The issue that we read about today in the Australian newspaper, and again I was disappointed, the journalist concerned, who I do normally quite like reading her stories, didn't have the courtesy to speak to the chairman of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. If she had chosen to, if Labor had been interested in a thorough debate on the human rights implications, if ACOS had been concerned about engaging in a thorough debate on the human rights implications, they would have gone not just to the report, they would have gone to the chairman's tabling statement, the statement that I give in this parliament every time I present the human rights report. And what would they have found? What would they have found? I might just add here, Senator Siewert didn't talk about it, Senator Moore didn't talk about it. They gave an incomplete explanation. What did the chairman say? I'd like to draw senators' attention to one bill in this report which is of particular interest and relevance to the committee's task of assessing legislation for compatibility with human rights. That bill, the Social Services and Other Legislation 2014 Budget Measures No. 2 Bill 2014, seeks to amend various acts relating to social security, family assistance, veterans' entitlements and farm household support to make a number of changes to certain Australian government payments. It goes on to say the committee previously sought, this is accurate, the committee previously sought the advice of the Minister as to whether the measures are compatible with these rights, noting that the statement of compatibility did not adequately identify and assess how potential limitations on the right to social security, the right to an adequate standard of living and the rights to quality and non-discrimination would be reasonable, necessary and proportionate in each case. That's not a sin. Many government departments don't meet the statement of compatibility test in the first instance. That's not new to this government. It was a feature of the previous government. And Senator Moore is nodding her head in agreement. But this is the critical point. The further information provided by the Minister in this case is an excellent model. Didn't hear that from Senator Moore, didn't hear that from Senator Siewert. Is an excellent model for the kind of detailed information and analysis required to assist the committee in its assessment of the human rights compatibility of legislation. This further information has allowed the committee to conclude that the measures are largely compatible with the right to social security and the right to an adequate standard of living, with identified limitations of rights being generally assessed as reasonable, necessary and proportionate in pursuit of a legitimate objective. Now, this is the other point that Senators Moore and Clare and the Australian newspaper and ACOS and the Labor Party omitted from their coverage today. Significantly, out of the 12 matters raised by the committee in relation to measures in the bill, the committee has concluded that 10 of these are compatible with human rights. Now, I don't know about you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, but in my language that's a distinction. That's more than a pass. That is a distinction. But this is the critical point. in an effort to prosecute their argument, Labor and ACOS, and the Australian newspaper, I can't believe I'm saying that, the Australian newspaper decided to go for half-truths and not the full truth. Half-truths and not the full truth. That is very disappointing. But in the brief moments available to me, it is not new. It is not new for governments to suffer the ire of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights, which speaks to its scrutiny value, which speaks to its parliamentary value. And I was just reflecting this morning, what other common familiar issue was there last year or the year before? And of course it was Labor's media reforms. It was Labor's media reforms that fell foul of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights, and they deservedly did so. They deservedly fell foul. And I'm just reading from a report in the Sydney Morning Herald now. Of particular concern to the committee, that's the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights, is Labor's proposal to appoint a single person, the public interest media advocate, to oversee newspaper regulators and judge whether media ownership is in the public interest. These bills, and I'm quoting now from the Human Rights Report, these bills appear to limit the right to freedom of expression and freedom of association, wrote the committee about the two bills that govern the self-regulation of newspapers. Now, it's true. It's true. I think many Australians would be surprised to learn that there is a human right to an adequate standard of living, that there is a human right to food and shelter. But the fact is, there is. The fact is that our country, under the stewardship of Holt, and I might add to my National Party colleagues, at the table was Black Jack McEwen as Deputy Prime Minister. The fact is that our country, rightly or wrongly, has signed up to international treaties. It has a parliamentary committee to oversee it. It's doing its good work, but Labor couldn't resist the temptation. Labor couldn't resist the temptation. I expect better from ACOS, the Labor Party and the Australian newspaper.